And we're happy to have with us Barbara Opall-Rome, Defense News Bureau Chief in Israel. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Are we seeing the Cold War returning to the region?
It looks like a toehold back into the Cold War era times alone. Russia is able to achieve with this doubling down in Syria. It seems it has reasonable hopes of achieving multiple things. First of all, to prop up the regime of Bashar al-Assad, which he views as Russia views as a strategic asset for decades. As you know, Latakia, they've been using that airfield, but Tartus is the only Russian naval base outside of the Russian Federation, and this used to be their center of gravity in Soviet times. So they need to prop up the regime of Assad. They need to battle ISIS because, indeed, I know it's a lot of PR that the Russians have been saying that they're coming to Syria to battle the Islamic State.
But the current deployment has the potential to change the momentum of the war?
Not the current deployment, but it's their modus operandi. This is exactly the Russian design. They start with a little, they hedge a little bit, they don't acknowledge what exactly the presence is for, and it's a very gradual until it's a fait accompli. That's what they did in Crimea, and that's what they are doing in eastern Ukraine. But about these multiple strategic objectives that they're doing by this buildup, we talked about the cultivating of new alliances, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Kuwait, arms markets, and most of all alone. In Ukraine, they're bleeding men and money. We know that. And this stepping into some kind of a leadership position, reasserting a dual power, a bipolar kind of region with the Russian involvement, will force NATO and Washington to deal with them now. It gives them the legitimacy, and they won't be punished so much over what they'll still keep their designs on Ukraine. They're still going to hold Crimea.
And they are dealing with them because the Americans are conducting mill-to-mill negotiations with the Russians. What are they talking about?
So they're not talking about anything right now. I mean, just Secretary of Defense Carter spoke with his Russian counterpart for the first time since he took office as SecDef 7 months ago. They're just starting to put together modalities to talk specifics. But it's so divided, the United States and the NATO allies. I mean, yesterday, Steinmeier and Secretary Kerry met in Berlin, and the German foreign minister clearly said that he welcomes the active, up-stepped Russian engagement in the region. And then Kerry, when it came his time to speak, he was talking about, well, we all have to find a new path forward. We have to work together. Very, very wishy-washy.
So Assad is coming back into the family of nations again?
Well, Assad, no, but that might be the price that they'll have to pay to maintain Russia as a constructive player and not a spoiler. And they do truly have a role to be a constructive player because the U.S. has no policy. Putin has a policy. Russia has, as we discussed, those various designs that they can accomplish by doubling down on Putin, on Bashar Assad. But the Americans don't know what is the end goal. We're talking 1 year now. It's a year that they've had this Operation Inherent Resolve. There's 60-plus nations in this coalition. The United States has spent, I think it's $4 billion already, 4,000-plus airstrikes in Iraq, 2,500 airstrikes in Syria. And what truly have they accomplished?
Not much. We've seen the Israeli Prime Minister rushing to Moscow, accompanied by the Chief of Staff, which I think is the first time that an Israeli Chief of Staff is making a visit in Moscow. Do you see a potential skirmish clash between Israeli and the Russian air forces?
The chances for confliction are so much greater. I mean, Israel, I don't have to tell you, Israel has been so adept at this fine balancing act and very surgically, with the utmost intelligence, deciding how it needs to preserve its red lines. And Israel has preserved its red lines. Israel has credibility. And in that respect, Putin does respect Netanyahu on those red lines. And Netanyahu will be there to reaffirm and reinforce and impress upon Putin that, hey, we have to act. So far, since even before the Arab Spring, we've had this modus vivendi that we're not interested in your interest in Syria. We have our interest in Syria, and let's deconflict. But it's interesting that I was part of Netanyahu's entourage in November 2013 when he was at the Kremlin trying to convince Putin not to go along with the what now is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It was interesting to see how Netanyahu used all these superlatives about close and intimate partnership and special friendship, and he was really using all this terminology that's reserved for the United States. And then when it was Putin's time to speak at this joint press conference, Putin got up and said, well, yes, we highly understand Israel's concerns, and we look forward to more cooperation in the field of biomedicine and cinema. So I think by having the Israeli chief of staff and the head of military intelligence, that it will lend more gravitas and show even more that Putin, please pay attention to us.
Barbara Opall-Rome, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.
And that's all we have time for tonight. Be sure to visit us again next week for another edition of I24 News Defense. For all the latest headlines, log on to www.i24news.tv. Have a safe night from the Jaffa Port.